Everyone says that it's the Super Bowl of international diplomacy. There is a certain rush, there is a certain glamour.
Even someone like Donald Trump, who would come and denounce it, was probably also having a great time being the centre of attention at the centre of the world.
Pretty much everyone sort of agreed when Trump said that the UN is no good on peace and security. There was a real fear that Netanyahu was going to announce formal annexations in the West Bank. Arab leaders had been lobbying Trump really hard to ensure that didn't take place. Trump made it clear that he wouldn't support annexations. There was quite a sense of energy, actually, that maybe this is time for middle-sized states to step up, play a bigger role in the system.
Even as the US is complaining that the UN's not doing enough, it is the repeated use of the veto, especially by the US and Russia, that is leaving the Security Council paralysed on a lot of these major global conflicts.
The next Secretary General also needs to be someone, even when the Security Council is stuck, someone who can help form political deals in a very divided world.
I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find order in our mad world. And this week, I'm recovering from my first ever visit to the UN General Assembly, where jet lag is compounded by everyone's obsession with holding really early breakfast meetings as well as late night drinks receptions. But at least I had no trouble at all with the UN escalators, unlike some VIPs. And to help me make sense of it all as an UNGA newbie, I am joined by a veteran UN watcher, UNGA attender, side event goer and big speech analyser. It's Richard Gowan from the International Crisis Group, an NGO that analyses issues around the world in order to prevent and stop conflict. And Richard is a fount of knowledge on the UN. I'm very glad to have you with us today, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Those of you who have joined the Mega Orderers Club will have heard the full version. This is a slightly shortened version for our main feed. But if you want the full inside track of the conversation, then please do sign up to the Mega Orderers Club. It's our subscription club for people who want to support this podcast and enable us to keep going, making this thing that we love and hopefully making a change in the wider world. How many times have you been to an UNGA high-level week, Richard?
Gosh, well, I've been working around the UN one way or another since 2005. I haven't always spent a lot of time around the sort of the high-level circus, but in recent years, it's been a professional obligation. So I've been to a lot of breakfast meetings. I've chewed on a lot of mini pastries while discussing policy issues over the years. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. Everyone says that it's the Super Bowl of international diplomacy. I guess that's true, but it's also a week that fills me with existential dread.
What's the worst thing about it?
I mean, I think people who spend all of their time around the UN, which sadly is my condition, there's a sense that it's a huge distraction from actual work. Diplomats who spend most of the year musing on peacekeeping in Africa or sanctions policy, suddenly find themselves just acting as bag carriers for ministers, most of whom don't know very much about the UN themselves. And even ambassadors become highly paid personal assistants for their presidents and prime ministers. There is a certain rush, there is a certain glamour. You do get to see a lot of people who otherwise you only see on the news, but it does eat up a great deal of time, and it does leave you, as I think we both feel now, really exhausted by the end of the week.
Well, yeah, but it's 4 p.m. and I'm still drinking coffee in an attempt to regain that breakfast meeting energy that I once had. But I think it's really interesting because I came in as an UNGA tourist, right? So I was super excited to be there. But definitely I could see that people I would ordinarily like to meet at the UN were often saying, I won't be able to meet, or in one horrific case, I can only meet before my meeting starts at 7. You have to meet them outside the security perimeter in one of those very crowded coffee shops around 2nd Avenue because getting through security is a complete nightmare. But on the other hand, in a lot of discussions about the UN just now, one of the recurring themes is the UN relevant to this problem? So it was quite interesting to be in this global spotlight where the UN felt like the centre of the world, and even someone like Donald Trump, who would come and denounce it, was probably also having a great time being the centre of attention at the centre of the world. So, I mean, is it actually good for the UN that there is this period where it's headline news every day for at least a short while?
I think it is good for the UN, and I actually think it's also good for the world because, at the end of the day, the UN is an interstate organisation, and it exists as a platform where different countries can come and meet and talk about their problems. Although there is a lot of gossip about the UN being in decline these days, and there's some reason for that, it's still striking that about 150 heads of state and government were in New York last week. Actually, in some ways, the least important part of what they do is give a formal speech to the General Assembly. I mean, most people don't pay any attention to the formal speeches by a majority of countries, but what leaders are doing and what ministers, are doing is running around, is having back-channel meetings, sometimes back-channel meetings with countries that it's difficult to talk to sort of transparently on a day-to-day basis. And I think that actually does allow a really enormous amount of diplomatic business to be transacted in a very, very brief period of time. So, even if the UN became an entirely dormant organisation for the other 51 weeks of the year, I actually think the high-level week would still have value. I mean, it's also, it's great for people who want to go shopping in Manhattan. You hear of delegations turning up with a dozen empty suitcases and then filling them up with goods that they can lug home. Definitely some people who just come along for the party. But I think there is some real business too.
I mean, there's clearly a real value in getting people together in person at that very high level. But it is also intriguing when you say that, that's not what most people see. Most people see clips of the speeches. So maybe we'll start with the big speeches. Of course, Donald Trump's has got the most attention. What did you make of Trump's very long UNGA speech?
Well, Trump spoke for nearly an hour, and he clearly veered a long way off his prepared remarks. And he covered everything. Had a lot to complain about. He complained about a UN escalator breaking down while he was on it. He complained about...
Very sad.
Tragic. He complained about problems with his teleprompter. And he also complained about the state of the UN as a whole. He was very tough, saying that the UN had not assisted him on any of his peacekeeping efforts, for which he believes he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. He accused the UN of facilitating human trafficking, and he culminated with quite a lengthy rant about how the UN is promoting the idea of climate change, which he says is a hoax. So I think if you were listening to all of that, you were probably thinking, good God, this sounds pretty awful for the World Organization. The irony is that in conversations after the speech, what we were hearing from everyone was that could have been worse. Because he did have a lot of tough rhetoric for the UN. He also had a lot of tough rhetoric, especially for the Europeans in the audience. He told the Europeans that our countries are going to hell because we can't manage migration properly. But he didn't actually have a single concrete policy line that would do fundamental damage to the UN system. He didn't announce that the US was going to pull out of any particular new UN arrangement. I mean, he's already pulled out of quite a lot, but he didn't add to that. He didn't say anything about funding that would fundamentally damage the organisation. And so actually there was a bit of a sigh of relief.
Beyond the Trump speech that grabbed all the headlines, what were the other things that people should watch if they want some highlights. I mean, Zelensky's speech was powerful and sobering and about as far as you could possibly get from Trump's speech, except that they both seem to agree that the UN isn't doing a good job on peace and security. Can you tell us a bit more about Zelensky?
So Zelensky has changed. It's interesting. In 2022 and 2023, Zelensky did seem to put quite a lot of trust in international institutions. I think it was 2023 he actually made quite a long speech about the need for Security Council reform. But I think as time has gone by, Zelensky has become less and less convinced that Ukraine gets anything meaningful politically out of the UN. And this year he was very direct about that. He said that we live in a world where there isn't a global institution that can protect countries, so the only way you can protect yourself is to arm up. He has been on a pretty negative journey when it comes to his attitude towards the UN. But the interesting thing is, Jane, that the other thing that has come through a lot of conversations over the last few days for me is that actually pretty much everyone sort of agreed when Trump said that the UN is no good on peace and security. Trump framed it as, the UN wasn't offering him enough support, which is a bit disingenuous because he hadn't actually spoken to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, since January. But there is a widespread feeling that the organization, which is meant to be a peace organization, just isn't doing that job at the moment. And there is quite a lot of criticism of Guterres for being too cautious in his approach to many crises. So actually what Trump said there resonated surprisingly strongly with a lot of his audience. As for other speakers who everyone was waiting for and made sort of some powerful statements, there was President Shura from Syria, who was very much the belle of the ball around High-Level Week. Everyone was keen to be seen with Shura because, he's a very charismatic figure. He was actually the first Syrian leader to speak at the General Assembly since 1967. And he sent out a very strong message that he's trying to build an inclusive Syrian state and everyone should get behind him. So I think he had a really good week. And then on the flip side, there was Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel, who spoke on Friday and, as we expected, gave a furious denunciation of every country that has raised any criticisms of Israel, and especially those like the UK that recognise the state of Palestine at the start of the big UN week. Again, it could have been worse. There was a real fear that Netanyahu was going to announce formal annexations in the West Bank. He didn't. Yes. Arab diplomats, Arab leaders had been lobbying Trump really hard to ensure that didn't take place. Trump made it clear that he wouldn't support annexations. And so Netanyahu didn't go there. But overall, his message for the UN was one of unbridled contempt.
So another topic that was hotly discussed around the side events, so not in the back rooms, not in the big speech chamber, but the many, many events where people like me go and talk to other people about policy. Lots of the events that I attended were about leadership, and specifically who might be the next UN Secretary General. What kind of person should that be? And indeed, is it time for that person to be a woman? And we did hear that Michelle Bachelet's name was put forward formally just a few days ago. And, as we think about all these things that are wrong with the UN, and particularly the failures on peace and security, I warned you that in this podcast we like to bring some order to the disorder. Can you imagine that a new UN Secretary General will be able to fix many of these problems? And what is the best case scenario? What is the type of leader that this organisation needs at this time to try to steer a way forward against all of the headwinds that we have?
So in the meetings that I went to, there were actually two separate discussions of leadership going on. There was quite a lot of talk about, the US has stepped away. The US is now a semi-detached power that doesn't go to a lot of UN meetings. Is there some way that some sort of coalition of middle powers can fill that space? There was quite a sense of energy, actually, that, maybe this is time for middle-sized states to step up, play a bigger role in the system. And I was actually quite enthused by that, because I'd expected to find most people being very fatalistic. But instead, there were a lot of people saying, no, we're going to keep on trying to make this organization run. So that was one sort of line of talk. And then there was, yes, a lot of gossip about who the next Secretary General might be. I mean, this is interesting because the conversation and the conventional wisdom have really changed in the last 12 months. 12 months ago, the conventional wisdom was that the next UN chief would be from Latin America, because
it's their turn.
It's their turn under a sort of informal rotation, but also it would be a woman. And it would likely be a woman with a big focus on development and climate change. I mean, that was what people were chatting about in September 2024. After President Trump returned to office, though, black became white, up became down, and the new conventional wisdom is that it has to be a man. And there is a man who is trying to take advantage of this mood, and that is Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, who is very, very openly campaigning. And, his message is that, we live in a dangerous world. We can't worry about things like gender. You need someone like Rafael Grossi, who's been negotiating over Iran and the Zaporizhia power plant, to lead. Now, while he is definitely the most prominent candidate at the moment, in the margins of the General Assembly, there was also quite a lot of pushback to the idea that this should be a coronation. And there were a couple of big events about the Secretary General selection, and there's definitely still a lot of people in the UN circuit who feel it has to be a woman. President Boric of Chile elevated that point by announcing formally that Michelle Bachelet, one of his predecessors, and someone with a long history with the UN, will be running. I think we're going to be hearing more announcements from a couple of female candidates in the very near future.
Rebecca Greenspan is one name I've been hearing a lot.
Yes, she's the current head of UNCTAD, the UN trade body in Geneva. She is widely expected to be announcing soon. And there are others in the mix. There's a lot of talk about Alicia Bárcena, who's a former Mexican foreign minister, again, someone with UN experience, who apparently has quite a strong below-the-radar campaign. I think this is going to be a pretty competitive race, but we don't know how it ends, because it does end with the Security Council having to recommend a candidate, and President Trump can veto any candidate he doesn't like, so can President Putin, so can Prime Minister Starmer. And trying to find a candidate, regardless of their gender, who all the big powers can agree on, is going to be, I think, a really, really difficult game.
Absolutely. And then add into the mix them having buy-in from the other 188 states at the UN, because I think you can certainly see that there may be a temptation for it to be someone who's a kind of Trump whisperer. But then what are the chances that that person falls out of favour with the US 6 months down the line and has nowhere else to go? I did hear some suggestions. I doubt the P5 will leap to go for it, but there have been some people calling for why doesn't the Security Council nominate 2 or 3 people and then let the General Assembly vote on it? Have somebody who's got that strong buy-in from the rest of the world, and they'll be better able to navigate a time when, frankly, they're going to have to make some really hard choices, including on the budget, and they'll need to get people behind them. Do you think that idea has any legs?
I don't think that the P5 are going to relax their grip on the process. They've been pushing back against even slightly more moderate suggestions of process reform. But I think you put your finger on something really important, which is if you just have someone who is perceived as the veto powers Secretary General, they are going to get bogged down in really big arguments, especially with the group of 77 developing countries, very, very quickly. you do have to campaign to be Secretary General in 2 registers. You do need to play the inside game and win over all the 5 veto players. But you also have now, I think, to convince the wider membership that you are a leader who will speak to their concerns around development and around climate change. And actually, it's not as important, but you do need to be able to bring along civil society and the media. So it's a very, very difficult job to sort of hit all those marks. We will find out who does it. I mean, I think if you go back 10 years, at the comparable point in the race, not very many people had picked out Antonio Guterres as the likely winner. There were other names that were more prominent. There was a feeling at that time, too, that it had to be a woman. But then Guterres did manage to sew up the P5, and he did perform well in his public appearances. And someone may come through in the same way this time around, who we haven't quite figured out yet.
And I think personally, obviously I'm biased because I'm from civil society, but if that person can really bring along civil society and the media, they will have a lot of power in terms of influence. If they are an inspiring speaker and somebody who can say things and really be quoted and listened to and seen as a moral compass, then there's something in that is slightly different from being the spokesperson for this gigantic bureaucratic international organisation.
And whoever it is, we do need someone who can regain some public resonance. Each spring I teach a class for a small group of very, very smart students about the UN, and I open with a picture of Antonio Guterres, his predecessor Ban Ki-moon, and then Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General when I started working here 20 years ago. It's remarkable. The students, at best, can only ever name one of those 3 people. Weirdly, it's often Ban Ki-moon. He has a certain sort of K-pop resonance, but
I've never thought of him in that way before. I think there's an AI-generated video to be made here.
I do feel like the UN is just losing the public salience that allows the Secretary General to sometimes reach out beyond member states and actually sort of, put some flesh into the whole idea that the UN represents peoples as well. So I do think the choice and the public profile are significant.
Yeah, and I think there is a hunger for that kind of ethical voice. Another organisation that has come back to relevance in recent years is the Catholic Church. If you look at the amount of attention that the current Pope and Pope Francis have that go way beyond Catholics because they're seen as just speaking up on moral beliefs, I think that's really fascinating. And I think there's something for others to learn there, even if they don't have quite the hundreds of years and the numbers of followers behind them. But there is a constituency out there for somebody that will speak about values.
In fairness, Guterres does speak about values quite a lot, but he has struggled, especially in the last few years, I think, to cut through just the sheer amount of noise and the sheer amount of chaos in the international system. I mean, it's also worth saying, we focus as civil society folk on some of these sort of big ethical questions. However, the next Secretary General is also going to have to tend to an organisation that is hemorrhaging cash, where staff morale is very low. And what UN officials and diplomats will be looking for as well is someone with a credible plan to, in all probability, shrink the UN, but shrink the UN in a way that minimises the human costs of cutting back an organisation that has become quite sprawling, that does have inefficiencies, but is still, supporting over 100 million people worldwide, day in, day out. So you have to be a big public figure, but you've also got to be able to, think about the system in a creative fashion.
Yeah, and this was something else I heard from a French diplomat speaking at a public event, saying, we're talking a lot about what kind of leader, but they also have to be a manager to manage this bureaucracy. I mean, maybe that's very French as well, and slightly depressing. But day to day, that is going to be a lot of what their time is taken up with, as you say. And I'll circle back to that question of peace and security for a closing question, because, we talked about how both Trump and Zelensky had something in common in terms of saying the UN isn't doing a good job when it comes to actually resolving conflicts. And, if the UN under new leadership is bringing more order to the world, should it focus on peace and security, which was its founding mission? Or should it be investing more of its time and energy into steering us through the climate transition and rethinking international development and things that basically aren't as easy for the Security Council to veto? Because obviously, even as the US is complaining that the UN's not doing enough, it is the repeated use of the veto, especially by the US and Russia, that is leaving the Security Council paralysed on a lot of these major global conflicts.
I mean, the problem is we all say the UN needs to prioritise, but then we also say that the UN needs to do all of the above. I mean, that is a contradiction that we often run into. But I do think that there is a sense that the next Secretary General, actually to carry weight on some of these other issues, also needs to be someone who can convince other leaders, even when the Security Council is stuck, they can talk to him and they can use him as someone who can help form political deals in a very divided world. I don't think that we're back in the 1990s. I don't think that we're even in the first decade of this century, where the UN made a big contribution to peace and security by deploying, tens of thousands of blue helmet peacekeepers. I don't think we're in a world where the Security Council is going to agree on very many new sanctions regimes. But I think we're in a world where there is still a need for some sort of impartial diplomatic figure with the backing of, whatever the international community is, to be going to Moscow, to be going to Beijing, to be going to Washington and trying to frame deals that will at least reduce global temperatures. And in fairness, Guterres did do that. Really only just once, but he did do that in 2022 between Russia and Ukraine with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I still think that a lot of UN folk are frustrated that there's only been one moment like that where Guterres has been able to pull off a big mediation success. That is partially because opportunities are few and far between, but I think the UN community as a whole wants someone who's going to be engaging in that sort of diplomacy slightly more often. When they look for the next leader.
Yes, they will certainly have a very full inbox, and let's hope they can solve even more conflicts than Donald Trump. Richard, it has been a real pleasure having you on the show. We will include some of your recent writings in the show notes, and people who are still clinging to X, like I am, can find you on there as well. Is there anything else that you'd like to draw our listeners' attention to in terms of things you've been doing, writing, or saying elsewhere?
I mean, you raise a really important question, which is actually if Donald Trump does achieve world peace by 2027, then the next UN Secretary General can focus on other topics. So maybe that's the way through. Look, if you want to get a sense of exactly how big the challenge facing the UN right now is, both as an institution but also in some specific trouble spots, Crisis Group put out a publication in mid-September called 10 Challenges for the UN in 2025 and 2026. I think that's a pretty good summary of where things stand. So I would point your readers towards that. And then on the US front, I had a piece in Foreign Policy, I think around the 19th of September, looking at what the US being a semi-detached member of the UN means for the organization. That still holds up even after Escalatorgate. So that might be something to look out for too.
Oh, excellent. I've seen the 10 challenges, but not the foreign policy piece, so we'll put both of those links in the show notes. And that's it for this week, listeners. If you too want to help order the disorder, then please Spread the word about our programme, leave us a 5-star review, check out our relatively new and very cool YouTube channel, and you can now subscribe if you want earlier access to this sort of discussion as well as extra exclusive videos. Link, as ever, is in the show notes. We also have a Substack where you can see some of my amusing pictures from running around heavily trafficked Manhattan. And it just remains for me to say a big thanks to our guest, Richard Gowan, and to our producer, George McDonough. Disorder is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Thank you for listening. Hope you have an orderly week.